Thank you. And everything I tell you will be true. Really. Well, everybody loves a man in the uniform, and this was certainly true about Captain Karl Offer. He was a self-styled German flying ace, a former POW, Germany's representative to the Panama, California Exposition, and a family hero. He also wore the coveted Iron Cross for bravery. When he arrived in San Diego, he became the man of the hour in all the social circles. But who was Karl Offer? Was he really everything he claimed? Let's do a quick fact check. Flying ace. Slide. He was the third aviator to enlist in the German Aviation Corps when it was formed in 1909. However, they only flew dirigibles, and they were used for reconnaissance. The first fighter planes actually engaged on July 1st, 1915, and it was a German plane and an English plane, and the German plane forced the English plane to land prematurely, and that was that. And there wasn't any real fighting till 1917 and 1918. By then, Karl was in San Diego. And well-known flying aces in World War I were very short. And if you take a look at that, and I know it's hard to read, these are very old documents, Karl is not on the short list. Nor is Karl on the longer list of pioneers of aerial warfare. That's easy for me to say. Somebody you might recognize, though, is the second one from the bottom, Baron Manfred van Richthofen, the Red Baron. And of course, to be a flying ace, you had to have 5 recorded kills. And I'm afraid Karl was not a German flying ace. POW. Well, he was actually traveling in the Orient, and a little skirmish broke out between the Japanese and the Chinese, and this was real common after the first Sino-Japanese War. And so Karl decided, well, perhaps I should report to the German embassy. And somehow, on his way to the embassy, he got mixed up with this band of Chinese, and he was captured. And he said the Japanese emperor treated him very finely and allowed him to come to America. But there was one stipulation. He had to promise never to come back and never to participate in their wars. So POW, German rep to the Panama, California Expo, slide. He listed himself when he arrived as an exhibitor. And he said he would sell jewelry. Oh, and about that Iron Cross, we're going to talk about that later. Upon his arrival in San Diego on March 23rd, 1916, he established a residence at 401 Olive Avenue, slide. No.
Little stars behind.
Yes. Karl's residence. It probably did not have the mural on it at the time. But he quickly became much in demand because, first of all, he was unattached. Secondly, he was very charming. Although reputedly not really very good looking. In fact, the newspapers reported sometime later and described him as heavily built and a trifle fat. But there was that uniform. Enter Eunice James. Eunice was also a darling of society and a very admired club lady. She was also described in the San Diego Union, but she was described as a rare beauty. And she was widowed. She'd been married to a gentleman named Leroy Ritter when she was 20 years old, but unfortunately he died of malaria 5 years later. And so she lived with her mother, Zuleika. And Zuleika was also widowed. They were both very highly connected and very rich. They were direct descendants of William Bradford, the first governor of Massachusetts. So naturally, they belong to the descendants of the Mayflower, the DAR, the colonial dames of America, and even Mrs. Horton's Wednesday Club. Additionally, because she was so lovely and charming, Eunice was the first hostess, along with Mrs. J.G. Buran, in the women's part of the California building on the first day of the Panama, California Exposition. So since both mother and daughter were widows, and they were very active in Washington, D.C., and Virginia, and Wisconsin, but they thought they needed a change of scenery. So they arrived in San Diego. Back to Karl. He had gathered around him at least half of the marriageable maidens and the widows in San Diego. And of course, Eunice was his favorite. So much so that they got involved in a scandal. And everybody loves a scandal, and San Diego ate this one up. It seems that Lorette Hill, and she was a jealous rival of Eunice, instigated a police raid on Eunice's apartment. Well, needless to say, Eunice and Karl were caught in a sticky situation, and they were promptly arrested, charged with vagrancy. That's what they called it back then. Well, they hauled them off to jail, and Zuleika hit the roof. She marched down there, bailed them both out, and the next morning announced their engagement. They were married a week later at St. James Episcopal Church. Now, Karl went to the altar willingly. You see, he needed money. He wanted a rich wife so that he could further his mission. He then he was so excited about his rich wife that he sent this little note back to his associates in Germany. And of course, as you can see, the Department of Justice got a hold of it later. And he says, I am well and married a charming widow, wealthy widow, a good financial. He was real proud of himself. So, he moved into Zuleika and Eunice's house. And this is still standing, of course. It's at 1968 First Avenue. And Eunice proceeded then to continue her club work. Now she's a proper married lady after, snagging the dashing Captain Offer. And Karl proceeded to do what he really came to San Diego for. And that was spy for Germany and to enrich his coffers by buying up a considerable amount of real estate in the area. He bought a lot of property up around Hillcrest. He tried to buy a lot of land in Tijuana because he had this idea that he was going to have a German airfield and a German flying school. And he also became very, very vocal. He did not believe in conscription, so he went to all the places where they were trying to enlist people for World War I. And he got into so many skirmishes saying what he had to say that he had to be rescued by the police a couple of times. He also tried to rile up unrest at the shipyards between the Longshoremen's Union and the Pacific Steamship Company, because what this would do would not only slow up production of the ships, but it would slow up them being able to move supplies out. Well, after all that ranting and raving, he was barred from being within a half a mile of all the naval bases. So how could he spy on the ships? And he was actually described, as one of those Germans who gives vent to his feelings and thoughts, and it is almost an impossibility for him to keep his mouth shut. Well, he was in a pickle. He needed a vantage point to report back to Germany about where all these ships were. He needed to find some place where he could look across the water and see them. Well, he became acquainted with a German couple named Henry and Lena Lohmann. And being German immigrants, they were German sympathizers. And they just so happened to have this nice little house with a big attic, perfect vantage point on the water, 227 11th Street. That sounds familiar? It's because it's this house and it's that attic. And they allowed him, here we go, they allowed him to use their attic as a vantage point, and it worked out very well. Of course, he was gone a lot then, so, Eunice was getting increasingly upset by his absence, but she was really getting mostly increasingly upset because he was spending all of her money. So she confronted him. Well, Karl moves out, and he moved to, the Hawthorne, and the Hawthorne is on First and Market, or First and Hawthorne. Now, unbeknownst to Karl, while he was living in the Hawthorne, and actually this is really only about not even a whole block from Eunice's house. So, but unbeknownst to Karl, the FBI was following him and continued to gather evidence, especially because he was having a lot of meetings with people that were already recognized German spies. So, by the order of the president, he was arrested at his residence on July 12, 1917, and hauled off to the San Diego jail. No bail, no visitors. The arresting officers were H.O. Fish, U.S. Marshal W.G. Carsey, and several Army officers. Well, they searched his apartment, and guess what they found? A big box of German iron crosses. And when they asked Karl about them, you know what he said? Oh, they were given to me by a benevolent association to sell. And so many of my family had them that I was privately told when I got back to Germany I was going to get one too. After all, he did say he was a family hero. Now, poor Mrs. Lohmann, the Lohmanns were not implicated, but her name was Lena. So she changed her name to Linda to appear less German. And little George Deo, who was living in the house at the time, he had nothing to say for a change. Well, Eunice promptly sued for divorce, claiming cruelty. She said Karl called her vile names and struck her. But, oh no, she has a problem. Some of the judges are saying she has no standing to sue. She's married to a foreigner. So doesn't that make her a foreigner? But she goes, wait a minute. I'm descended from the Mayflower. Well, Eunice goes to court, wearing a very large hat, dabbing her eyes a lot. Oh, and carrying a letter from the U.S. Attorney General, who is a friend of her mother's. Eunice gets her divorce. Meanwhile, Karl was still incarcerated. He was sent to L.A., and prepared to go to Ellis Island, where he thought he would be repatriated to Alsace, where he was from. But they decided that no, he's a little bit too vocal, we better keep him here for a while. So he was sent to Fort Douglas, that's in Utah, for the remainder of the war. Now, Fort Douglas really wasn't a very bad place. And many of the Germans who were there, and there were quite a few of them, took advantage of the amenities. Slide. Oh, one more. The barracks weren't much, but, slide, they had English classes. There were a lot of Germans in the local area, so they came to visit. And they even took these guys skiing. But Karl remained aloof, writing letters to anybody he thought might help him. Nobody answered him except for one, and that was the Purple Hat lady from the Theosophical Society in Point Loma. But she had enough trouble, so she couldn't help him. Well, Eunice gets her divorce, but after her divorce, she's no longer married. She's a victim of scandal. What is a girl to do? Well, she had been telling her troubles to a much younger, as in 25 years old, Sergeant Major Percy Wiley Knighton, who also happened to be one of the soldiers that helped incarcerate Karl. You know, what a tangled web, right? They became very friendly and mentioned a lot about town. In fact, tongues were really wagging again. So 4 months after her divorce, Zuleika, fearing yet another scandal, made a hasty and clandestine trip to Santa Ana with her best friend, Emily Seville, and Eunice Wiley, as he preferred to be called, in tow. Slide. One more. And there was a very hasty overnight marriage where Eunice listed her name as Sanford James to avoid detection by the local papers, and she wore a little disguise with glasses. Well, slide. Made the papers anyway, coast to coast. But now we get a good look at the players. There is the lovely Eunice with her little glasses on. There's Karl writing letters, and yeah, he really wasn't very good looking. But check out Wiley. The very studly young Wiley. Well, they returned to San Diego. Wiley resigned from the Army, and he got a job as manager of the San Diego Syrup Company. Now, believe it or not, this marriage lasted about 10 years. But of course, Eunice was getting a little bit long in the tooth by then. She was 49. And Wiley was getting a little restless. So Zuleika to the rescue again. She gave Wiley a handful of cash, told him, don't you ever come back to San Diego, and he took off for LA to become a writer. In the 1930 census, slide, well, it's very difficult to see, but here it is over here. Eunice lists herself as a widow. It's very respectable. 3 years later, after having had it with all of this, poor Zuleika passes away. She's buried in the family plot in Wisconsin. And Eunice is on her own. Well, in 1942, Wiley resurfaced. Not in San Diego, though. He kept his promise. He stayed in LA. But he decided to rejoin the Army. So he rejoined the Army. He got the same rank as when he had retired from the Army before. And he spent the rest of the war behind a desk stateside. Eunice continued to live a semi-quiet life, going to all her club meetings, and she finally passed away on January 12th, 1955. Slide. Whoops, there we go. Nope, that's Percy. But Percy doesn't pass away. We're having a little problem with this because poor Rhiannon could not be here tonight. Eunice passed away on January 11th, 1955, and Wiley then finally passed away June 1st, 1971. There he is. And he was buried at Little Rock National Cemetery because he was a veteran. Now, what do you think Karl's doing all this time? We're not done with him. But what of Karl? Well, he was repatriated back to his native Alsace, which they now call Strasbourg. But he found Germany with no money, no jobs, and the military weren't heroes anymore. I mean, they lost the war. So what is he to do? Well, the ever-resourceful Karl promptly marries a Fraulein 23 years his junior, and they go back to China. Shanghai this time, but not for long. They immigrated to America. Slides. And there's one, where a lot of Germans came through Angel Island, and they lived in San Francisco. Now Karl lists himself as an importer of wines and also tries this little scheme where he wanted to exchange German marks for American money. Like, they would give him all the German marks, and he would give them American money a little bit at a time. He didn't get many takers. They do have 3 children, Karen, Roberta, and Karl Jr., and they apply for citizenship. Slides. I have one there, petition for naturalization, and I believe we have one more for Doris, his wife. Yes, Mrs. Elaine Doris Offer. And here's the children. Well, they applied for citizenship, and they are granted citizenship. And everything went fairly smoothly for a while until World War II came along. Well, all the Germans who had been, let us say, vocal during World War I were asked to leave the West Coast. Slide. So yes, Karl was one of them, and it's very hard to see, but his name is right here. Karl Offer. He was allowed to return after the war, though, and believe it or not, Karl lived till 1951, August 1st, and he is now buried in Colma, California at Cypress Lawn Memorial Park. So thus ends the saga of Karl Offer, the spy in the attic, and his ill-fated venture into San Diego society. However, does he really go on? Or perhaps he has ventured back in the attic. Slide. And according to the San Diego Union last Thursday, that's exactly what he has done. Thank you. And I will tell you that he's very angry with me now.